Hello, my name is Morgan Patelka. I'm the chair of the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies here at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm excited to host the first event in the 2020-2021 speaker series, Blackness in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. This speaker series is made possible because of the sponsorship of the Carolina Asia Center and the UNC Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, as well as the Institute of African American Research, all here at UNC. The series is hosted by my home department, the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and it's part of our launch of a new graduate program in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. We are currently recruiting new students to apply, and the first cohort will begin their studies in the fall of 2021. I'd like to turn things over to the moderator for tonight's event, Professor William Sturkey of the History Department here at UNC Chapel Hill. William is a specialist in the modern history of the United States, particularly the American South, and he's written books about race relations, and he is going to introduce our speaker. The video got a little bit cut off here at the beginning because my Zoom call crashed, so much of what William had to say is unfortunately cut out, but Professor Troutt Powell, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania in the History Department and is an incredibly accomplished scholar of the history of the Middle East, is our speaker, and I'll turn things over now to William.
Further ado, I give to you now Professor Eve M. Troutt Powell.
Thank you very much, Professor Sturkey. I appreciate it. And I thank both you and Professor Patelka for hosting me. And now I'm going to share my screen, if that's possible, so I can start my talk. Okay. And I will. Okay, can everybody see? William, if you would just nod your head so I'll know that
Looks good.
You see. Folks, I'm gonna share with you something a little strange. Zoom has done something to my eyes, and between reading a paper and looking at the slides, if I start taking my glasses on and off and on and off, it's just because I'm having trouble adjusting to the closeness and the depth. I hope you're not suffering from this too. My undergrads are actually too young to be suffering from this, but they are. But this is the life we're leading right now. So let me begin. I'm talking today about posing slaves for the camera, race and memory in the representation of slaves in Khartoum in 1882. Oh, and let me go back and keep it there. All right. Soon after the introduction of photography in the second quarter of the 19th century, the eyes of photographers in Europe, the United States, the Ottoman capital, and its Arab provinces were drawn to the bodies of slaves, particularly African slaves from Sudan and Ethiopia. Their ways of viewing these people were influenced by their intellectual backgrounds, their artistic training, their cultural and social upbringing. Their gaze could be deeply affected by current events in a rapidly changing Middle East, and how much money was paid by patrons commissioning particular representations for very specific exhibitions, scientific inquiries, or newspapers. Whether the camera became a kind of social microscope for focusing on racialized types when applied to the bodies of slaves, or whether it mimicked and mirrored highly stylized Orientalist painting, those using this instrument were in constant dialogue with current discussions of race, inferiority, and colonialism, vibrantly so. Often the viewing of slaves crossed from literature to the camera and back through literary salons and international art markets in which the Middle East was extremely important. The landscape and politics of Egypt and Sudan in particular fascinated European governments as much as the people of the region inspired topics for European art markets. So I'll start with one of the most popular painters, Orientalist painters of the Middle East. This is Jean-Léon Gérôme and his painting, The Bath, completed in 1870. Many prints of this remain available for sale. Here is another very famous painting by Gérôme, painted 6 years later, A Pool in a Harem. And again, this is another example of his highlighting the body of a Black woman next to the body of a Circassian concubine or slave. And finally, one of his biggest masterpieces, and this was built upon the work of photographers that he hired, Ottoman photographers. This is the Grand Bath of Bursa, which he exhibited between 1880 and 1885 and is considered one of his finest pieces. So my talk today shows how a dramatic series of armed occupation and political rebellion in the Nile Valley challenged the narrational talents of the camera. In 1882, Egypt's political movement, known as the Arabi Rebellion, had been put down by British forces, who then occupied the country. This occupation of the British would last for 70 years. In that same year, about 1,400 miles south in the city of Khartoum, Egyptian and British administrators and military figures were beginning to reckon with the rising force of the Mahdiya, an Islamic rebellion against the Egyptian administration of Sudan. Louis Vossian was a French diplomat who was sent to Khartoum in 1882 because of his talent for photography. Much of Vossian's work is still in print today. So well regarded was he for his abilities to chronicle the politics of the times. Vossian wove his sense of racial identities and difference in his work on late 19th century Sudanese society. So let's see how he saw Black figures. All right. So in 1884, two series of acclaimed photographs about the races of Sudan were published in Paris by Vossian. So they were taken in 1882, and it took 2 years for them to be published. The constructions of racial identity framed in Types du Soudan, or Sudanese types, and his second collection, Souvenirs de Khartoum et du Soudan Égyptien, or Memories of Khartoum and the Egyptian Sudan, closely echo themes of representations of Black bodies in then contemporary French art, like the paintings I showed you by Jean-Léon Gérôme. And Vossian paid very close attention to the vocabularies of race then current in Sudan. In 1881, Vossian, a member of the French consular corps, had been commissioned by Prince Roland Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, to travel to the part of Africa then known as the Egyptian Sudan and capture by camera the images of the residents of its capital city. Bonaparte played a huge role in the establishment of French scientific institutions, most notably the Geographic Society of Paris. And this commission was one of many whose fruit, photographs, would fill exhibition halls with images of diverse people newly available to French art, photography, and the budding field of anthropology. Vossian applied great energy to his job and took 108 images for this volume, Types du Soudan. This is an authoritative volume in which the most important European, Egyptian, and Sudanese officials were presented, many of whom would later be known as the major architects of Sudanese colonial history. But Types du Soudan is not only a who's who of colonial officials. Most notably for my talk here today, the photographer paid close attention to slaves. Vossian chronicled the relationships between Sudanese women and their European or Arab husbands, registered surprise at the word marriage when interracial couples produced children, and regularly photographed enslaved people from different parts of the Sudan. The photographer left copious captions, some with the photos and some left in his notes, that show how fascinated he was with the varying levels in which Black people participated in Khartoum society. Vossian's second volume, Souvenirs de Khartoum and du Soudan Égyptien, was a more informal and personal collection of photographs. This volume usually documents his own relationships with Sudanese and European leaders and his own servants and slaves. Here, there is less reliance on the staging and settings of the pictures and more natural backgrounds like his home and the homes of his friends. There is a quiet peace in these pictures, a calm Khartoum in which the photographer is shown to be completely at ease with daily life. But brewing behind these pastoral scenes was a huge rebellion in Egypt, in which Egyptian soldiers demanded Egypt for the Egyptians, and an Islamic revival and rebellion that was on its way to conquering much of the Sudan. 2 years after Vossian completed his collections, the Mahdist rebellion had besieged Khartoum. By 1885, many of the officials photographed by Vossian were either dead, imprisoned, or sold to the Mahdist armies. So drawing on these two photographic collections and Vossian's notes, I would like to explore with you today why the networks of slavery figured so prominently and how the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children were staged and configured. As certain as the photographer was about where to place Black bodies in social and cultural hierarchies, Vossian often expressed confusion when presented with or imagining racial mixing or racial passing. Damage was done to Vossian's sense of race when he tried to represent what seemed to him the strange intimacies taken with the bodies of enslaved mothers, particularly those treated with respect. Confusion is mixed with grief here. He felt keenly the power of the Mahdist rebellion. Khartoum would change forever. By the time Vossian's photographs were published in 1884, the Mahdist armies had conquered the city. The relationships that Vossian photographed were devastated by 1885, making it even more significant that these pictures became prominent displays in European museums. I have some epigraphs in this that I'm going to just skip over for the sake of time. But here, this part is called "The Photographer as Consul and Consult." So let me show you a picture of Louis Vossian. Okay, just hang on a second. No, I won't go there. I'll just leave that right there. Okay. All right. Louis Vossian is the center of this photograph. I hope you can see him. This is a difficult print. Here he is right here. He's the one seated, okay? This was taken in 1882 at his residence in Khartoum. The residence is the French consulate where Vossian had performed the role of vice consul for 2 years. On either side of him, okay, stand 2 sergeants or chawashes and his private servants, Elmas and Rizgallah. Elmas he names as a eunuch and Rizgallah as being from the Nuer tribe. Both descriptions would imply at that time they were enslaved or liberated slaves who were members of the consulates. This is the first photograph presented in Souvenir de Khartoum, and it immediately introduces Vossian as the authority with the experiential authenticity. And this is both technologically and culturally important. Vossian's 2 photographic volumes of Sudan were only the second set of books to be published in France that had photographic images embedded within their pages, a huge technical achievement that only became available in 1880. Culturally, it fortified a particular kind of faith in the veracity of the camera. This authenticity of the gaze, reinforced by the transparency registered by the camera, is also the justification of the pact made between the author-photographer and the reader. I went there and I saw it for you. And I'm quoting there Thomas Gazantre as he talks about the technical imagery and of this book. Vossian was therefore both author and photographer and a political leader for the French government. So his dual authority is echoed throughout these volumes. Vossian himself had joined the French Consular Corps in 1877, and his first major posting was Khartoum. He arrived at a time of increasing economic and political turbulence. The Sudan was administered by the Egyptian government. In Khartoum, this meant Turco-Circassian army officers and Arabic-speaking Egyptian soldiers like Ahmed Urabi, whose discontent with the Egyptian government was fueled partly by his service in Sudan. Coptic traders and translators, merchants from the Levant and from Europe, traders in Arabic gum, ivory, and slaves from Sudanese provinces. For years, the Egyptian ruler, the Khedive Ismail, had also hired British officials to regulate the slave trade. And in 1877, the most famous of these, General Charles Gordon, outlawed the sale of slaves from the equatorial province of Sudan, or what is now South Sudan. This threat of income loss was keenly felt in Khartoum's business networks, and the new law was interpreted as a provocation by the Mahdi and his followers. And it was that the fact that it was issued by a Christian British military officer did not increase its popularity. But as Vossian's photos show, the anti-slave trade law was not very effective. There are slaves in over half of his pictures. But its fitful implementation threatened a vibrant commercial tradition in which the northern Sudanese tribes were deeply invested, like the Dangalawi, the Mahdi's own tribe. General Gordon and other officials in the Egyptian government became the targets of the Mahdi's pronouncements, viewed as obstructionists to the establishment of a pure, simpler Islamic state along the Nile. In Egypt, concurrent protests against corruption, financial misuse, and increased European political influence took on a more secular, but no less demonstrative tone. Ismail, the same ruler who had hired General Gordon, had become bankrupted by the loans that British and French banks had given to his treasury. In 1878, he was deposed in favor of his son Taufik, and British and French advisors took over the treasury under an office known as the Public Debt Commission. This commission demobilized, without pay, thousands of Egyptian soldiers and officers, leaving them destitute in Egypt's biggest cities and prompting Arabi's movement to reinstate their pay. This means that all of those photographed by Vossian found themselves in 1882 between two significant and growing movements, Arabi's and the Mahdi's, that meant to restructure the political and economic infrastructure of all major locations along the Nile Valley. Through his pictures, Vossian attempted to articulate the social status quo of these intimately connected regions of the Nile Valley. As in the introductory picture, as I'm showing you, of Souvenir de Khartoum, the ladders of hierarchy are carefully resurrected. Louis Vossian was a government official fully vested in photographing racial and social hierarchies in Khartoum society. His pictures were dedicated to, and perhaps diminished by, their exploration of types instead of lives. Nor was Vossian an artist. There was no investment in the aesthetic of the slaves' bodies in his photographs, none of the pathos we see in abolitionist photography of Sudanese or other African slaves, nor the beauty of Orientalist constructions of African skin color that can be found in photos taken of Ottoman eunuchs by artists who studied in Paris with the likes of Jean-Léon Gérôme. So let me begin with eunuchs, okay? And let's see, I think this, okay. I am just noticing that my slides are out of order, so please bear with me. All right, so here is a picture from Type du Soudan of eunuchs, okay? These eunuchs bear a familiar dignity, but remain silent on the page. They are also tall in size, no hair on their faces, wearing foreign clothing, and on their heads, tarbushes. Wait a second, there are no tarbushes on these heads, hold on. Here they are. Okay, so can you see, this is from here, this is one of the eunuchs serving, and this is another one of them serving Vossian. The posture of their bodies serves as a protective gate, particularly for the vice-consul photographer himself. Any security granted to Vossian, a French citizen, would have had to come either from the British or the Egyptian army. There would have been no French soldiers in Khartoum in 1882 unless they had been hired by Ismail, the ruler of Egypt. Rizgala and Elmaz are never shown, here they are, in any other role than that of guard. And in the more formal Type du Soudan, they are not even named. As in figure, a reader has to use Vossian's notes and compare these faces to know who these servants are. So I'll show you yet another picture. And you just know they're not named in this one, but here you can actually see them a little bit better from following all of the different notes that these are Elmaz and Izgala, who are eunuchs in his service. There is one picture, however, in Type du Soudan that bears testimony to the unique relationship that Sudanese eunuchs had to local politics, wealth, and power. Let me go back to this one. Okay. In this photo, about 8 eunuchs sit, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 eunuchs sit, posed for Vaucion's camera. The short caption describes them as the principal eunuchs of the harems of Khartoum, but the longer description identifies them as a group of Black eunuchs belonging to the leading Muslims of Khartoum. They thus embody the power of prominent Muslims in Sudan and in Egypt, so worrisome and illegal in the eyes of French and British colonial officers. They reflect the power to continue buying and selling slaves. These eunuchs played a very different, much more intimate role than those guarding Louis Vaucion himself. I do want to ask you all to take a close look, because one of the things I've looked at these photographs for I feel like years, and yet I presented this not that long ago when one could still travel, and the University of Chicago, and some of the students noticed that this particular man is laughing, and that there's some kind of joke going on in which there's laughter, which I'm not sure Vaucion meant that, but it's a kind of interesting and delightful little surprise that I hadn't noticed staring so long at these photos. But the menacing power of the ability to buy slaves is also embodied in this photograph of Sheikh Suleiman. Let me bring him up. This is one of the first slides in which someone is racially characterized. The caption to this slide reads, Sheikh Suleiman, pure Sudanese race, provost of the Khartoum merchants. The note to race is important. Through Sheikh Suleiman, Vaucion introduces his readers to the construction of religion and race in Sudan. When the Sheikh appeared in print in Souvenir du Khartoum, the merchant is in the same pose. So this picture is in both volumes, heavy, opulent, and jauntily holding a cigar, but the caption is quite different. Here, Vaucion presents him as a classic Musulman du Khartoum, or Khartoum Muslim. The caption then reads, Provost of the Merchants of Khartoum, dealer in ostrich feathers and more or less in slaves, has afterwards joined the Mahdi, a pure scoundrel. This could reflect Vaucion's investment in the ostensible Anglo-Egyptian mission of General Charles Gordon, which had been set to extirpate the slave trade from Sudan. It could also be an angry memorial to the majority of his photographic subjects who were either imprisoned or killed by the Mahdi's armies. But never in either volume is slavery itself repudiated. The photographer's mission is completely buffeted by the slaves around him. Also represented in both volumes is the Syrian trader Fathallah Jahami. He was famous for being intimate of Gordon's until the last minute. But in Vaucion's pictures, he is more notable for his family. Fathallah Jahami married an Abyssinian woman with whom he had several children. In several photographs, he is proudly surrounded by them, even holding his mixed race children who are dressed just like him. Okay, so here he is with his Abyssinian wife. And here he is holding his 2 sons. I hope you can see this son who's clearly restless on his lap, and who he's holding quite closely. And this son has his arm affectionately around the shoulder of his father. An important group of Vaucion's subjects were notable for their own abilities to shift between racial identities, or certainly able to confuse the photographer himself. I'm going to ask the audience to please bear with me. I'm going to use words that are racially uncomfortable for many in both French and in English, and I hope that you will bear with me. I just want to use the same words that he used to bear witness to how Vaucion was categorizing people. So in some instances, French words like nègre, négresse, noir, arabe, and then his translations of these words into nigger, black, Arab, cannot do justice, as if these words should be expected to the situation he observed. In both Type du Soudan and Souvenir de Khartoum, no one is called Sudanese. For Votion, black, nègre, nigger, and sometimes Arab are used without respect for the slaves he has posed. Slaves tend to be naked or half naked unless they are eunuchs. So the nudity of servants, slaves, dancers, and these women are described as Arab as a signifier of lives lived on the very bottom of Khartoum's social hierarchies. For those who visually look to be people of color, but who are not enslaved and hold positions of power, Votion places them more in terms of geographical or ethnic origin. Merchants and soldiers, consuls and doctors are Egyptian, Egyptian, Syrian, Syrian, pure race du Sudan, pure race, pure Sudanese race, and de race turque et de race negroïde, so of Turkish race or Negroid race. Europeans are Anglais, English, Grec, Greek, and Allemand, German. No European women are depicted in these photographs. All of the wives shown are married to Egyptians and Syrians and are themselves identified as Abyssinian, or Darfurian, from Darfur, Darfurian. Even the widow of the deceased Sultan of Darfur is posed. So let me give you another example. Votion shows us Faragala Adjuri, a mustachioed official with a tall and elegant Abyssinian woman by his side. Okay. So I showed you, so no, I'm sorry, that was Jehami, I've shown you that. Here is also, okay, there is another picture, this time of Habib Houri, and this is a very interesting picture, in which Votion noted that he was Syrian and his family. And in the center of this is the wet nurse. To the left, a Dinka servant, and to the right, an Abyssinian servant. Please take a look at this picture. It's quite unusual. The wet nurse holds the eye of the viewer. She is bare-breasted, and on each side of her is one of Houri's children. Houri himself has his arm around her. This and her direct gaze at the camera are the clues to her centrality in the household. She actually seems to be the household as they sit and stand posed before one of Votion's white tents. In this next slide, okay, it's posed in a very similar way. Anaroto Musi, and here he is right here, as Votion described, Maltese established in Khartoum, poses with his family, and the caption reads, a negress servant, okay, and Maltese Abyssinian children. And there are, and in this slide, so this photo, Votion displays slave women of diverse races belonging to the chief of the Coptic colony of Khartoum. Like the Sudanese merchant Suleiman Bey, whom I discussed earlier, and I will go back to his slide just so you can remember him. Like him, and like them, like this slide, there emerges from this photo an insinuation about the nature of the slaveholder's power, this other business. Finally, in slide 18, let me show you this one. Okay, Votion photographed 3 little girls. Can you see them right here? All dressed up and their hair in curls, whom he noted as little girls born out of the marriage between a Syrian Catholic and an Abyssinian woman. And then here follows a picture of the father himself. See, this is the father of the 3 little girls. These kind of pictures of 3 little girls of mixed background, of these mixed children, of these children, of these children, these are the types that defy, just by their presence in the photographs, the pure races that Votion was hoping to find. One senses from Vossian a great curiosity about the society of Khartoum, and yet a deep and judgmental commitment to hierarchical racial orders that conflicted with what he hoped to chronicle from the lens of his camera. He came from a society in which social mobility depended on the public adherence to this structure. In 1900, when he was the French consul in Sydney, Australia, he questioned the name of a consul general he assumed was illegitimate in a public and derisory manner. He was really a stickler for propriety and rules of order. The captions that Vossian wrote for his photographs of miscegenation bear an air of the same derision and mockery of these African women's elevated positions. He made this even clearer when looking back at his volume several years later in his notes. He describes certain African servants as concubines, explaining that for the Syrian men, polygamy was widely practiced, not officially, but very much present. And he went on to write that the picture of Habib Houri and his family gives an idea, in his own words, of the incredible mixing of races that operates in Khartoum and that makes it so difficult to conduct ethnographic research. Vossian's derision of many of the Syrian, Egyptian, and Sudanese men in these photographs, whether Muslim or Coptic, suggests his own racial condescension to men he considers to be not quite white. And this attitude adds to the sense of hierarchies over which the photographer and his European subjects sit on top. And how would non-European audiences view these pictures? The wives of these men, even posing for Vossian's camera, is a blurring of hierarchies. Muslim wives, Syrian, Egyptian, or Sudanese would never have been allowed to be posed or exhibited in such a public and open way. As Mary Roberts has shown with her work on Ottoman harem paintings, women like these, who fit more into Vossian's definition of wife, not concubine, would themselves have protested, and I quote from her, "Respectable Muslim women would not pose for European male painters. Thus, European women were commissioned to undertake their portraits. A major priority for the harem women was that these portraits were never to be seen by men. This requirement necessitated that the paintings were entirely executed within the harem, including the varnishing and framing, and that they be covered at all times." So the visibility of the slaves and concubines, or wives, as Vossian questioned, the visibility of these women here is paradoxically a cloak of invisibility to the cultural norms of public behavior and exhibition. So let me wrap up with the photographic conclusion of these Black bodies. In Vossian's society of Khartoum, many of the protagonists we see in the photographs were dead by the time his pictures were exhibited. The photographer continued to keep close eyes in Sudan, noting that the eunuch Rizgullah was sold to Jesse Pasha and that Elmaz was sold to Yusuf Pasha, who later became governors. These notes were also sent to King Leopold of Belgium, a monarch deeply interested in the racial hierarchies of other territories in Central Africa. Vossian showed no record of what happened to the Abyssinian wives and the mixed children of the officials shown in the photographs. They live on, unclaimed, in his pictures. Even though missing a photographic gravesite, the Black people in his photographs found ways in which to make their own light shine. They used ornaments or hairstyles or touched each other, details in which their humanity defies being bloated images of the Negro, so loathed by Ralph Ellison. And here in this final slide, we can see a woman who has owned so much of the pose that even Vossian comments. Her caption reads, Fadl el Anaz, Negresse de Sennar, so a negress of Sennar, 28 years, the wife of a tribunal judge. In his notes, however, Vossian describes her more carefully. A beauty of the country, wife of a tribunal judge, her hairstyle shows the universal style adopted by the women of Khartoum province, ribbons and fine braids framing the face. With his hint at her stylishness, the reader can see this beautiful self-fashioning in many of the wives posing with their husbands, in the dresses in which they present themselves and the quiet stillnesses of their pose. We can see among these women a will to be seen and seen correctly. Hopefully this article serves as a remembrance of this selfhood and their lives. untypified by racial categorizations. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Hopefully you can imagine all of the applause that you would normally hear. Fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I would invite members of the audience to please use the Q&A function here to go ahead and submit questions. But I'll go ahead and start it off with the first question. And I have to say, this has been on my mind lately because I'm reading Frederick Douglass's biography, the David Blight book, and he's the most photographed human being probably of the 19th century. And of course, this is about American abolition movements and such. I was wondering if you could talk more about the nature of slavery as it related to these different political movements and how these photographs fit into that conversation. And, were there other ways that photography was used and, that are widely available that were, sort of refuting what you see in some of these photographs here?
I haven't, okay, well, let me start. This article comes out of a book I'm working on now about the visual culture of slavery in the Middle East and the relationship between painting and photography is very important here. And I would say that as soon as cameras were invented, or as soon as people learned how to do daguerreotypes, or as soon as all that, it hit the Middle East right away. And Ottoman sultans really used a lot of photography, and Jean-Léon Gérôme's hired photographers who he trained. And when he went to the Middle East, and he spent years in Cairo and in Istanbul, he was working with photographers while he was doing this. So this idea of a realistic picture of the Ottoman Empire, of Egyptian society, Egypt was then nominally a province of the Ottoman Empire, was very, very important. And the ruling elites really, they trafficked in the slaves, and they trafficked in images of the slaves. So that's the first thing I would say. I have not yet come across, in this period, I have not yet come across photographs that would be terribly different from what Vossian did, although they could be more beautiful, less posed. It's in later, around the turn of the century, especially when the Ottoman Empire is changing drastically before World War I, in which the Sultan Abdulhamid II is overthrown, that eunuchs in the Ottoman Empire begin to use the camera for their own images when they're kicked out of these palaces. And they often use Ottoman journals. They put their pictures in them, as did some of these Circassian women of these elite harems, so that they could find their families. And that happened about the turn of the century. You also do find, I guess where you would see some that would be different is in abolitionist photography, which would be very similar to some of the abolitionist photography that you find in the United States at the time. I'm exploring sort of the connection between Frederick Douglass himself, because Frederick Douglass went to Egypt in the 1880s, and he responded very visually to who he was seeing and what he was seeing around him and how he was being characterized racially. So I hope that answers your great question.
Yeah, sure. I have one more that sort of combines an idea somebody mentioned in the Q&A, but that was really interesting toward the end where you talked about the pose of that woman. And I just wonder, is there any evidence that reveals anything about, how Africans envisioned these photographs being used, what the audience might have been, and the way that they then responded when they were being photographed?
Yeah, that I only have Vossian's captions for that. And there is a brilliant book. and I'm blanking on it. But there was a really brilliant book about T. Jack, what is his last name? It's all about how, in my earlier work, and tell this in my memory, I look a lot at how abolitionist photography and also the photography of missionaries, particularly Catholic missionaries, gives former slaves, particularly in Sudan, a chance to reorient themselves in a way, to cast themselves in a different kind of uniform. There's a particular former slave from southern Sudan who lived at the same time as Vossian lived, who, well, he died, yeah, he was, who became fluent in Arabic and Italian, became part of the Camboni missionary in Khartoum, and then went to Italy and was a teacher of Arabic in Helwan in Egypt, who presented himself, he was a priest, so he looked like, you know, he wore the outfit of an ordained priest. And so yes, there was quite a bit of particularly among those former slaves who were brought in to Catholic missionary communication circles.
Okay, great. I'm going to jump in with some questions from the audience here. The first one is, have you found that photographs by Ottoman photographers are mainly just iterative of British and French visual language of race, or do they show different understandings of race or other markers of difference that are prioritized?
Ottoman photographers were often commissioned by British and French. They were often commissioned by British or French elites, like Gérôme, for architecture. So the Gérôme painting I showed you of the great bath in Bursa, the picture that was taken by Pascal Sebah, who was a frequent supplier of images to Gérôme, he only took men bathing, and he only took the structure of nobody would ever have been allowed to take a picture in a bath with naked women. Nobody. Nobody. It's very interesting to think that Ottoman sultans, starting particularly with Abdulaziz, who was a frequent buyer of Gérôme, and the Sheikh Bey, who was Jérôme's actual student in the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He painted also Osman Hamdi Bey, who actually helped found the University of Pennsylvania Museum. He was also a student of Jérôme's. They didn't paint these kind of scenes. They did not paint. And so I would say that, and I'm speaking more to painting than I am photography, in a way that the painters knew their limits, the Ottoman painters knew their limits. But Jérôme could make up whatever he wanted to and sell this. And what's so fascinating to me is that both these kind of photographs and these kind of paintings are extremely popular in the Middle East today. And there's really a lot of exploration of what Orientalism means, and a kind of great collecting gesture to sort of re-own what Orientalism means. I hope that answers that question.
I think one of the things that the question was really getting at was, is there any difference in how Ottoman photographers sought to capture race than British or French photographers, be it lighting or a pose or anything that they might focus on?
In the first book of Osama Makdisi, in which it's about self-Orientalism in the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman sultans, especially the last really powerful one, Abdulhamid II, in the 1870s, he loved photography, and he had a lot of kind of studio photographs taken of different ethnic types throughout the empire, and they would be posed. And sometimes you see Sometimes you see Black figures in these, and they look very similar to what Jérôme would have painted. You don't see so many women. There was also a whole industry of the postcards, the carte postale, which had prostitutes leaning out of windows, barely clothed. These were not photographed so much by Ottoman photographers as by European photographers. Sarah Graham Brown has a book called Images of Women. I think this was published in the early 1990s, though, in which she really looks at how photographs of women, particularly elite women, would often be posed with darker skinned figures who were their servants and their slaves. And those are another source of where we get a sense, like Vossian, of certain racial hierarchies. So yeah, I would say, I don't want to oversimplify it to say that in the Ottoman Empire and in Egypt, racial categories were exactly the same as French categories, or exactly the same as American categories, because they really weren't. You don't have United States slavery, the institution of creating eunuchs, castrating young boys for service in the women's quarters. But I would say that by the time we get to the late 19th century, darker skin does imply a life of servitude.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this question's from Andrew Simon. Andrew Simon says, hi, thank you for the fascinating talk. I'm wondering if any of these images have a digital afterlife. Do any photos, for instance, surface on present day social media? And if so, to what ends? Here I'm thinking of Lucy Ryzova's work on Egypt photography and online platforms.
Oh, well, I need to take a look at that, Andrew, and I appreciate that. And if you could repeat that, William, I just want to write that down. the
Last name Ryzova.
Oh, Lucy Rusova. Lucy Rusova. Yeah. Okay, no. I am familiar with her work. Although I hadn't noticed that she included, she's working on family albums, and I hadn't noticed that she had included too many pictures of servants or of slaves. If I'm wrong, Andrew, please correct me. I don't remember that. In fact, I would say that most current work on photography in the Middle East at this time has really avoided the issue of slavery or race, which is why I'm so indebted to Mary Roberts, this wonderful art historian at the University of Sydney, because she goes right into the constructions of race in Ottoman painting and European painting of Ottomans. For the digital, in terms of their digital afterlives, I don't think these photographs have. These photographs, although they are so easy to find, they're in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and I just stumbled across them. And they're very easy to find. And if you look up, if you just Google photographs of slaves, Sudanese slaves, there are some actually really beautiful pictures of Ottoman eunuchs from the period I mentioned, from the turn of the century in 1908, when people, I think, were beginning to pose for the cameras. The Ottoman eunuchs were posing for the cameras themselves. There's a very famous picture of a eunuch smoking a cigarette outside some of the gates of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul that I have hanging in my office. So yeah, there are digital afterlives of these. And then in terms of Jean-Léon Gérôme, there is nothing you cannot buy today that he painted between, let's say, his painting life really got going in the 1830s and 40s. He died in 1904. He continues to be, he has paintings everywhere across he was, for some reason, very popular among collectors, American collectors, when slavery was abolished here in the United States. He's everywhere.
Okay, the next question is from Audrey Sung. Professor Powell, could you talk more about the contrast between plus-minus captioning, if I'm saying that correctly, such as noting the beautiful women, but also how nobody was called Sudanese, or I guess back then they didn't know it was positive or negative, they were just captioning their photos?
Oh, okay. I'm not really sure I know what plus minus means there, but I do know why, I know why Votion captioned his photos.
Positive, negative, I'm thinking is how I should have phrased that.
I'm unable to answer that question. That I don't know. Um, um, all of this information, I would be willing to say he was a vice consul, but he was also acting in many ways as a scout and a spy, if you will, for the French government, who were in great competition with the British for control of the Nile Valley. And in fact, by the 1890s, there was almost a war between the British and the French about Sudan. And the French lose. Everywhere Votion goes after, he goes to Burma, he goes to Hawaii, and he goes to Australia. Everywhere he is sent to explore the racial topography of places where the French government is hoping to create a colony. So I think there is a great deal involved in the captions, because he summarizes all of his captions in letters to the government and in the letter I mentioned to King Leopold of Belgium. So these are very political cards. These are very, very political captions, but I really apologize that I can't really answer the positive, negative aspect, and I'll have to explore that.
Okay, Victoria Rovine says, thank you for a fascinating lecture on such an interesting corpus of photographs. You mentioned that you're looking at the relationship between painting and photography. I'm curious about the relationship between photography and printmaking, particularly for mass distribution in mass media, like in newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know whether these photographs were published in contemporary accounts of Northeast Africa, whether in political coverage, travel accounts, etc.?
I have never, ever seen them published in that way. They are, by the way, the books, they're tiny. They're really tiny. Of these, this type of 19th century work was small. And that's why I was so surprised when I came across them. I have never seen them mentioned before. It wasn't until I started, and maybe that's part of the fact that most of us who work on the Nile Valley we tend to focus our archival background on the Egyptian archives, Sudanese archives, private collections, and very, very, very much British archives, particularly the Sudan archive in the University of Durham. And I know that I have just begun a couple of years ago starting to look at what the French did in Egypt, and because of my interest in Jérôme. And I think that part of it is that we don't look so much at French language archives. When I started doing work on the eunuchs, and I have an article about their use of photography, all of this is in French, and none of it, I never found any of this at the Public Record Office, nor did I find any of it at the Sudan archive. The Ottoman, one of my students, Ezgi Jakmak, who has done a lot of work in the Başbakanlık in Istanbul in the Ottoman archives, she's found quite a few photographs, as did my former student Jada Karamursa, who's now at SOAS. But yeah, no, this one was different, and that's why I'm so happy I found it, and I'm so happy there are captions, because that doesn't happen all the time.
Yeah. Tanya Smith asks, this reminds me somewhat of the book The Colonial Harem. How does your research connect with ideas presented in that text?
The Colonial Harem, yeah, it corresponds a lot with that, and Adel Alouche's book, and if that's the right book that you're referring to, yeah, I that book was one of the things that sparked my interest in exploring imagery.
Great, and I have to ask. So King Leopold has come up several times in your talk, and I'm just wondering. So what is the gaze from King Leopold, especially in light of the incredibly disturbing photos that, of course, would emerge out of the Belgian Congo just decades from there? How, how are these in conversation?
A decade, a decade.
A decade.
Yeah, that's the scary thing. And I think that what you don't see in these Vaucion photographs is the violence involved, you know. But there were slave raids all the time. That you don't really, you don't see photographs of that. You see etchings and drawings of those, but you don't see that violence. But I think it's important to remember that Leopold was looking for some kind of way of some kind of official observer who could help him understand what was going on in the Congo at the time. But the pictures that we see of the rubber workers whose hands have been amputated, or those were not taken. Those were not official photographs. Those were photographs that were commissioned to find out what kind of dirty work was going on, but they were not at all commissioned by Leopold.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have, unless there's anybody that wants to squeeze in a final question.
I have a question, if I'm allowed. Eve, thank you so much for a marvelous talk. Obviously, here we are in 2020, living in a version of American society where hopefully questions about the afterlife of slavery in this country are more in the air. I don't mean to imply people haven't been talking about this for decades, forever, but somehow these questions have penetrated the public consciousness, especially of white liberals, maybe more than was true in the past. What is the kind of contemporary resonance of the images you're looking at in the Middle East and in Middle Eastern studies?
That is such a great question. First of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me to speak about my work and not inviting me to talk about Blackness in the Middle East, because I feel like all I have been talking about this semester is Blackness in the Middle East, and the Middle East Studies Association of America is wrestling with this. In the spring, there was a lot of talk on Twitter and in social media about blackface performance in the Middle East, in Lebanon, in North Africa and Morocco. A lot of it was happening in Cairo, a lot in the Gulf, and I was interviewed by Al Jazeera, and one of the reporters sent me all kinds of things to look at. I mean, I really learned more from the reporters, I think, than they learned from me. And what kind of came through was that people do these performances. They're not referring to the American South. They're referring to the Sudan or to Nubia. Most people in the Middle East, when challenged about this, say, no, it's a joke. We're not serious. This is a sign of affection and love. There is, although people who are of darker skin in cities like Cairo and Alexandria, especially if they're not, if their Arabic sounds foreign, or if they don't have Arabic, or if they look like refugees, because there have been many Sudanese refugees, Ethiopian refugees, etc., are often called abid, which is the Arabic word for slave. It's one of many words for slave, but this one in particular has a skin color association with darker skin. And I think that what this reflects is that, and what I've learned discussing this with a lot of people in the Middle East, is that there's not really, the history of slavery is not really taught, that people, it's not required and it's not really taught, and that people tend to know about it through private family memories. So, you know, I would say to some of my Egyptian colleagues, you know, I hear this word abid all the time, you know, and I hear this all the time. And what is that? And they say, no, Eve, it's different than what you think. And then they come back to me like, you know, we always wondered what was the relationship. Not everybody, not everyone's family had slaves, but many. We've always wondered what her relationship was. This auntie of ours, you know, who was darker skinned, who never married or something like that. There's a tremendous tradition in the 19th century in very elite households of the female slaves relating the stories to the children they were taking care of how they were captured. But you only find this reading through the memoirs of some of the most elite figures in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt. So it's a family lore, but it's not taught. But let me just say in conclusion that I'm not so sure we're getting the message here in the United States either. And you know, I'm really not so sure people are hearing it. And so I don't mean in any way to sound like, well, at least we figured it out here, but they haven't figured it out over there. None of us have really come to terms with the impacts of slavery.
Well, thank you, Professor Sturkey, for moderating and for all of your scholarship. Thank you, Professor Troutt Powell, for a brilliant talk and incredibly informative answers to all these questions. And thank you, everyone, for coming. This is a brave new world for the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, having an online Zoom-based speaker series, but hopefully this was a successful first instance. And with that, I bid you all farewell and thanks.
Thank you all.
Take care.
I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Good night.
It was so nice to meet you both. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Signing off.